Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from rural Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1880, the Treadaway family vanished from their homestead in Boone County, Virginia, leaving behind only scattered belongings and a house that neighbors would later describe as carrying sounds that had no earthly source. The official record, filed with the county clerk on November 15th of that year, states simply that the property was abandoned voluntarily. Yet the testimonies gathered decades later paint a far more unsettling picture of what drove a respected farming family to flee their home in the middle of harvest season, abandoning not only their land, but everything they had spent years building together. The Treadaway house stood on 160 acres of fertile bottomland along Cripple Creek, approximately 8 miles southwest of the county seat of Lebanon. The property occupied a bend in the creek where the water moved slowly through rich alluvial soil that had been deposited over centuries by spring floods. Dense stands of oak, hickory, and maple bordered the cleared fields on 3 sides, while the creek itself formed the 4th boundary. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse, providing privacy and independence, but also ensuring that the nearest neighbor lived more than a mile away through difficult terrain. Built in 1875 by Thomas Treadaway, a former railroad worker turned farmer, the 2-story wooden structure featured the typical design of rural Virginia dwellings of that era. The foundation consisted of carefully fitted fieldstone that Thomas had quarried himself from an outcropping near the creek. The frame was constructed from local timber, primarily oak and chestnut, joined with traditional mortise and tenon techniques that Thomas had learned during his years working on railroad construction projects throughout the Appalachian region. The main floor housed a parlor facing the creek, a kitchen with a large stone hearth, and sleeping quarters for Thomas and his wife Eleanor. The rooms were connected by wide doorways that allowed air to circulate during the hot Virginia summers, and each room featured at least 2 windows to provide adequate light and ventilation. The kitchen hearth was built large enough to accommodate the cooking needs of a farming household, with iron hooks and pot hangers that Eleanor had brought from her family's mill in Russell County. Above the main floor, an unfinished attic space stretched the entire length of the house, accessible only by a narrow staircase that Thomas had constructed himself using local oak. The attic was intended eventually to be divided into additional bedrooms, but the demands of establishing the farm had prevented Thomas from completing this work. The space remained unfinished, with exposed rafters and rough plank flooring that showed gaps between the boards. Small windows at each end of the attic provided minimal light and ventilation to the space. According to the 1880 census records, Thomas was 42 years old and Eleanor 38 when the events occurred that would drive them from their home. The couple had been married for 15 years, having met when Thomas worked on the Norfolk and Western Railway line that passed through nearby Lebanon. Eleanor had come from a family of mill workers in Russell County, where her father operated a small grain mill that served farming communities along the Clenich River. The courtship had been brief but intense, with Thomas frequently traveling the 25 miles to Russell County during his free time to visit Eleanor and her family. Eleanor was described by contemporaries as a quiet but industrious woman who possessed the practical skills necessary for frontier farm life. She could preserve food, tend sick livestock, assist with difficult births, and perform the countless other tasks that were expected of farm wives during that era. Her garden was renowned throughout the Cripple Creek area for its productivity and organization, featuring not only vegetables for the family table, but also medicinal herbs that she used to treat both human and animal ailments. Thomas had developed his farming skills through necessity rather than family tradition. His background was in railroad construction, a trade that had taken him throughout Virginia and West Virginia during the expansion of rail lines in the 1860s and 70s. The physical demands of railroad work had given him considerable strength and endurance, while the technical aspects of the job had taught him carpentry and engineering skills that proved valuable in farm construction projects. The Treadaways had established themselves as reliable and respected members of the small farming community that clustered around Cripple Creek. The community consisted of perhaps a dozen families spread across several square miles of difficult terrain, connected by primitive roads that became nearly impassable during wet weather. Social interaction centered around the Methodist Church in Lebanon, which families attended when weather and distance permitted, and around cooperative work projects that required the participation of multiple households. Thomas was known throughout the community for his skill with carpentry and often helped neighbors with building projects during slack periods in the agricultural calendar. His railroad experience had taught him techniques for joining timber and constructing sturdy buildings that many local farmers lacked. In exchange for his assistance, neighbors often provided help during planting and harvest seasons, creating a network of mutual support that was essential for survival in the isolated mountain region. Eleanor participated actively in the Ladies' Aid Society at the Methodist Church in Lebanon, an organization that provided assistance to families experiencing illness, death, or other crises. She was frequently called upon to assist with births throughout the region, as her practical knowledge and calm demeanor made her a valuable aid to the circuit doctor who visited the area irregularly. The income she earned from this work, though modest, provided the family with additional cash that could be used for purchases of manufactured goods and supplies that could not be produced on the farm. Their property was considered one of the more prosperous in that section of Boone County, with 30 head of cattle, numerous hogs, chickens, and fields that consistently produced good yields of corn and tobacco. The cattle were primarily Durham stock that Thomas had acquired through careful breeding and trade, representing a significant investment that provided both milk for the household and beef for sale in Lebanon. The hog operation supplied the family with pork for their own consumption and generated additional income through sales of surplus animals to neighbors and merchants in town. The tobacco crop was particularly important to the family's economic well-being, as it represented their primary source of cash income. Thomas had learned tobacco cultivation techniques from neighbors and had gradually expanded his tobacco acreage as his experience and success grew. The tobacco barn that he constructed in 1878 was considered one of the finest in the area, featuring a design that provided optimal conditions for curing the leaf while minimizing fire risk. The first indication that something was amiss came in late August of 1880, according to a letter found years later among the papers of Martha Hensley, a neighbor who lived approximately 2 miles downstream along the creek. Martha and her husband Samuel operated a smaller farm on 40 acres that Samuel had inherited from his father, one of the earliest settlers in the Cripple Creek Valley. The Hensley property included a ferry crossing that provided the primary means for residents on the south side of the creek to reach Lebanon and conduct business with the outside world. In the letter, dated August 28th and addressed to her sister in Wise County, Martha Hensley wrote that Eleanor Treadaway had appeared at her door the previous morning in a state of considerable agitation that was entirely out of character for the normally composed woman. Eleanor had asked to borrow a shotgun, claiming that sounds from the attic of their home suggested the presence of intruders or perhaps wild animals that had somehow gained access to the upper story. The request was unusual, not only because of Eleanor's obvious distress, but also because of the time of day she had chosen to make the visit. Martha noted in her letter that Eleanor had arrived shortly after dawn, having apparently walked the difficult 2-mile path along the creek in darkness or near darkness. The journey from the Treadaway house to the Hensley ferry involved crossing several streams, navigating through dense timber, and following animal paths that were treacherous even in daylight. For Eleanor to have undertaken this journey alone in the early morning hours suggested an urgency that alarmed Martha considerably. What made Eleanor's request particularly unusual was that Thomas Treadaway owned several firearms, including a hunting rifle that he used for deer and a pistol that he carried when traveling to market in Lebanon. The family also kept a shotgun specifically for dealing with predators that might threaten their livestock. When Martha Hensley asked why Eleanor did not simply use one of her husband's weapons, Eleanor reportedly became evasive and stated only that Thomas was away on business and had taken his firearms with him. Martha Hensley later noted in her letter that she found this explanation suspicious and troubling for several reasons. Thomas had been seen working in his fields as recently as the day before Eleanor's visit, making it unlikely that he had departed on an extended business trip without Martha's knowledge. The isolation of the Cripple Creek community meant that the departure of any adult male for more than a day or two was typically discussed among neighbors, both as a matter of social interest and as a practical security measure. Additionally, Martha knew that Thomas rarely traveled on business during late August, as this period was crucial for tobacco harvesting and required his constant attention to ensure that the crop was gathered at optimal maturity. The timing of Eleanor's claimed absence made little sense in the context of the farming calendar, particularly given the significant investment that the tobacco crop represented for the family's annual income. The borrowed shotgun was an old but serviceable weapon that Samuel Hensley had acquired years earlier for protection against bears and other large predators that occasionally wandered down from the higher elevations. Martha provided Eleanor with the weapon along with a supply of shot and powder, noting that Eleanor's hands trembled visibly as she accepted the firearm. Eleanor's unfamiliarity with the weapon was apparent, as she required instruction in its loading and operation, despite having lived on a farm where firearms were common tools. The shotgun was returned 3 days later by Thomas himself, who appeared uncharacteristically withdrawn and offered no explanation for his wife's earlier request. Thomas had always been friendly and talkative during his previous interactions with the Hensley family, often stopping to discuss farming techniques, weather prospects, or news from the outside world when his travels took him past their property. On this occasion, however, he seemed eager to complete the transaction as quickly as possible and leave. Martha Hensley described his demeanor as nervous and distracted, noting that he repeatedly glanced back toward his house during their brief conversation at the ferry landing. His clothing appeared disheveled, as though he had dressed hastily, and she observed that he seemed to have lost weight since their previous encounter several weeks earlier. Most troubling was his response when she inquired about Eleanor's health and the circumstances that had prompted the weapon loan. Thomas mumbled something about his wife being overwrought by the heat and the demands of harvest season, but his explanation lacked the conviction and detail that would have characterized his normal conversation. He avoided making eye contact during their exchange and appeared visibly relieved when Martha indicated that no further discussion was necessary. As he walked back toward his property, Martha noticed that he frequently paused to look back, as though concerned that he might be followed or observed. September brought the first reports of unusual sounds emanating from the Treadaway property during evening hours. James Patterson, whose farm bordered the Treadaway land to the north, later told investigators that he had begun noticing strange noises during his evening walks along the property line. Patterson's property included a pasture that extended to within a quarter-mile of the Treadaway house, and his evening routine included checking on livestock and securing gates and fencing before darkness fell. The sounds that Patterson observed were unlike anything he had previously associated with normal farm activities or natural phenomena in the area. He described them as rhythmic tapping or knocking that seemed to come from the direction of the Treadaway house and occurred most frequently during the hours just after sunset. The sounds were regular and persistent, continuing for periods of 10 to 15 minutes before stopping abruptly. The rhythm was too consistent to be attributed to woodpeckers or other wildlife, yet too irregular to suggest mechanical activity like the operation of farm equipment. Initially, Patterson assumed that Thomas was working on some construction project in his barn or outbuildings that required evening work after the completion of daily farm chores. Late summer was a common time for farmers to undertake building repairs and improvements while weather remained favorable, but before the intense activity of harvest season began. However, Patterson's curiosity was aroused by the fact that the sounds seemed to come from the direction of the house itself rather than from the barn or other structures where such work would more typically take place. As the sounds continued night after night throughout September, Patterson became increasingly curious about their nature and origin. The persistence of the activity suggested a major construction project, yet Patterson had seen no evidence of building materials being delivered to the Treadaway property, nor had Thomas mentioned any significant construction plans during their casual conversations at church or community gatherings. On several occasions, Patterson attempted to locate the source of the sounds by walking closer to the Treadaway house during the evening hours when the noise was most apparent. However, he discovered that the sounds would cease whenever he approached within 100 yards of the building, as though whoever or whatever was generating the noise was aware of his approach and deliberately avoiding detection. This pattern of behavior was particularly puzzling, as it suggested a level of awareness and intentionality that would be unlikely in legitimate construction activity. Patterson noted that the Treadaway house often appeared completely dark during these evening episodes, with no lamps visible in any of the windows, despite the early onset of autumn darkness. The absence of interior lighting during periods when mysterious sounds were emanating from the property was highly unusual, as farm families typically required artificial light to continue essential activities after sunset. The combination of strange noises and apparent abandonment of normal evening routines created an atmosphere of mystery that Patterson found increasingly troubling. The situation took a more disturbing turn in early October when Eleanor Treadaway failed to appear at the monthly Ladies' Aid Society meeting at the Methodist Church in Lebanon. This absence was highly unusual and immediately noted by other members of the organization, as Eleanor had missed only one previous meeting in the 5 years since joining the group. That previous absence had been due to a severe bout of influenza that had confined her to bed for more than a week and required assistance from neighbors to maintain basic household functions. Eleanor's participation in the Ladies' Aid Society had been consistent and enthusiastic throughout her membership. She regularly contributed handmade items for the group's charitable activities and had volunteered for numerous projects that required travel to assist families throughout the region. Her absence from the October meeting was particularly notable because she had been scheduled to lead a discussion of preservation techniques for winter vegetables, a topic on which she was considered an expert among the local women. When questioned about his wife's whereabouts, Thomas provided conflicting explanations to different inquirers that raised additional concerns among community members. To some church members, he claimed that Eleanor was visiting relatives in Russell County and would return within a few weeks. To others, he stated that she was ill with a nervous condition that required rest and isolation from normal social activities. The inconsistency of these explanations, combined with Thomas's obviously uncomfortable demeanor when discussing his wife's situation, created speculation and concern among the close-knit community. Reverend Samuel Morrison, the Methodist minister who oversaw the Ladies' Aid Society, became sufficiently concerned about Eleanor's absence and the conflicting explanations for her condition that he decided to pay a pastoral visit to the Treadaway home on October 12th. Morrison had served the Lebanon Methodist congregation for 8 years and had developed close relationships with most of the farming families in the area. His pastoral visits were typically welcomed by community members and provided opportunities for counseling, prayer, and discussion of both spiritual and practical matters affecting rural life. Morrison's account of this visit, preserved in a letter to his denominational superiors dated October 14, 1880, provides the most detailed contemporary description of conditions at the Treadaway house during this critical period. The letter was written as part of Morrison's regular correspondence with church authorities and included his observations and concerns about the spiritual welfare of his parishioners. The document was discovered in church archives in 1957 during research into the history of Methodist congregations in southwestern Virginia. According to Morrison's letter, Thomas answered the door after an unusually long delay that suggested either reluctance to receive visitors or difficulty in reaching the entrance from other parts of the house. When Thomas finally appeared, Morrison noted that his appearance had deteriorated significantly since their previous encounter at church several weeks earlier. Thomas seemed to have lost considerable weight, his clothing appeared disheveled and poorly maintained, and his demeanor suggested chronic fatigue or illness. Thomas appeared reluctant to invite the minister inside the house, offering instead to discuss Eleanor's condition while standing on the front porch. This behavior was highly unusual, as rural hospitality customs strongly emphasized welcoming visitors into the home, particularly clergy members, making official pastoral calls. When Morrison insisted on seeing Eleanor personally to assess her spiritual and physical needs, Thomas reluctantly led him into the house and toward the couple's bedroom on the main floor. The interior of the house showed signs of neglect that surprised Morrison, given Eleanor's reputation as a meticulous housekeeper. Dishes remained unwashed in the kitchen, laundry was scattered around the parlor, and dust had accumulated on surfaces that would normally have been cleaned regularly. The contrast between the house's current condition and the standards of cleanliness and organization that Eleanor had maintained previously was stark and troubling. Thomas led Morrison to the couple's bedroom, where Eleanor lay in bed with the curtains drawn despite the afternoon hour and the pleasant October weather that would normally have encouraged opening windows and allowing fresh air to circulate. Morrison noted that Eleanor appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, as though she had not been eating or sleeping properly for an extended period. Her complexion was pale and drawn, and she seemed to have aged significantly since their last meeting at church. When the minister attempted to engage Eleanor in conversation about her health and spiritual welfare, she responded only in whispers that were often so faint as to be nearly inaudible. Her responses to his questions were brief and seemed to require considerable effort, as though speaking was physically or emotionally difficult for her. Morrison noted that Eleanor frequently glanced upward toward the ceiling with an expression that he described as fearful and anxious, as though expecting some threatening presence to materialize above them. Most troubling to Reverend Morrison was Eleanor's apparent fixation on sounds that he himself could not detect despite careful listening. During their conversation, Eleanor would suddenly become silent and tilt her head as if listening intently to something above them in the attic area of the house. These episodes would last for several minutes, during which Eleanor appeared completely absorbed in whatever she believed she was hearing. When Morrison asked what she was hearing, Eleanor would only shake her head and mumble incoherently about voices calling her name and sounds that suggested movement in the unoccupied space above their bedroom. Thomas's behavior during the visit was equally disturbing and added to Morrison's growing concern about the family's welfare. Thomas appeared constantly agitated and repeatedly urged the minister to conclude his visit and leave the house, claiming that Eleanor needed rest and should not be subjected to prolonged conversation. However, Morrison observed that Thomas himself seemed unable to remain still or focused during their discussion, frequently moving around the room and glancing toward the ceiling in a manner similar to his wife's behavior. When Morrison attempted to lead the couple in prayer for Eleanor's recovery, both Thomas and Eleanor appeared distracted and unable to focus on the spiritual exercise. Eleanor's attention remained fixed on the ceiling, while Thomas seemed preoccupied with sounds or movements that Morrison could not perceive. The minister later wrote that he had never encountered such a disturbing atmosphere during a pastoral visit and felt compelled to cut short his stay, despite his concerns about leaving the couple in their obviously distressed condition. As October progressed, the Treadaway family's isolation from their community became increasingly pronounced and began to attract concerned attention from neighbors and business associates. Thomas ceased attending the weekly livestock sales in Lebanon, an absence that was immediately noticed by other farmers who relied on these gatherings not only for commercial purposes but also for social interaction and exchange of information about farming techniques, weather patterns, and community affairs. The livestock sales had been an important part of Thomas's weekly routine for several years, providing opportunities to market surplus animals, purchase breeding stock, and maintain the business relationships that were essential for successful farming in the isolated region. His sudden absence from these events, without explanation or advance notice to potential business partners, suggested either serious illness in the family or some other crisis that prevented normal participation in community commercial activities. Thomas also stopped participating in the cooperative grain harvesting that was traditional among the Cripple Creek farmers during the autumn season. This cooperative system involved groups of farmers working together to harvest each family's grain crops in succession, sharing labor and equipment to complete the work more efficiently than any individual family could manage alone. Thomas's failure to appear when scheduled to help with neighbors' harvests was considered a serious breach of community cooperation and generated considerable concern and speculation about his circumstances. His own fields, which had been meticulously maintained throughout the growing season, began to show signs of neglect that were visible to anyone passing the property. The corn crop, which should have been harvested during October, remained standing in the fields as the grain dried on the stalks and became increasingly vulnerable to weather damage and wildlife depredation. Livestock that had previously been carefully confined to designated pastures began wandering into areas where they could damage crops and create problems with neighbors. Local merchant Samuel Crawford noted in his ledger that Thomas had not appeared at his general store since late September, despite the fact that the Treadaways typically made weekly purchases of supplies and staples that could not be produced on their farm. Crawford's store served farming families throughout the Cripple Creek area and provided essential goods including salt, sugar, coffee, ammunition, and manufactured items such as tools and hardware. The absence of regular customers like the Treadaways was immediately apparent and suggested either financial difficulties or other problems that prevented normal participation in the local economy. When Crawford encountered Thomas by chance on the road to Lebanon in late October, he observed that the farmer appeared to have lost considerable weight and seemed reluctant to engage in the casual conversation that had previously characterized their relationship. Thomas's responses to Crawford's questions about family welfare and farming activities were brief and evasive, lacking the detailed discussions of crops, livestock, and community affairs that had been typical of their previous interactions. Crawford later recalled that Thomas appeared nervous and distracted during their roadside encounter, frequently glancing back toward his property as though concerned about leaving it unattended for even brief periods. This behavior was unusual, as farmers typically welcomed opportunities to visit with neighbors and discuss mutual interests when chance meetings occurred during travel to town or other business activities. The final recorded sighting of either Thomas or Eleanor Treadaway occurred on November 2, 1880, when postal carrier Henry Willis observed Thomas standing motionless in the front yard of his house during the early morning hours. Willis made regular weekly deliveries to the scattered farms in the Cripple Creek area, following a route that took him past the Treadaway property every Wednesday morning. His observations of conditions at various properties provided him with insights into the welfare and activities of families throughout his delivery area. Willis later recalled that Thomas appeared to be staring upward at the roof of his house with an expression of intense concentration, as though listening to something that the postal carrier could not hear. Thomas remained in this position for the entire time that Willis was within sight of the property, showing no awareness of the postal carrier's presence despite Willis's attempts to attract his attention with calls and waves from the road. The postal carrier noted that Thomas's posture and behavior suggested someone who was deeply absorbed in listening to sounds or communications that were not apparent to outside observers. Willis had seen similar behavior among hunters who were attempting to locate game by sound, but the intensity and duration of Thomas's concentration seemed excessive for any normal activity. Most troubling was Thomas's complete lack of response to external stimuli, including Willis's attempts to gain his attention. When Willis passed the same location on his route the following day, he noticed that the Treadaway house appeared completely deserted. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cold November morning that would have required heating for human comfort, and the livestock that had previously grazed in the nearby pasture were nowhere to be seen. The sudden transition from Thomas's strange vigil in the yard to apparent total abandonment of the property alarmed Willis sufficiently that he felt compelled to report the situation to authorities. Concerned by these observations and the accumulated reports of strange behavior and isolation from the Treadaway family, Willis reported the situation to Sheriff Benjamin Hayes in Lebanon. Sheriff Hayes had served in law enforcement in Boone County for 12 years and had experience dealing with the various problems that affected rural communities, including domestic disputes, property crimes, and occasional violence related to illegal whiskey production and consumption. However, the circumstances surrounding the Treadaway situation were unlike anything in his previous experience. Sheriff Hayes, accompanied by deputies William Clark and Robert Sterling, visited the Treadaway house on November 5th to investigate the reported abandonment and assess whether criminal activity might have been involved in the family's disappearance. The three officers represented the entirety of law enforcement personnel available in Boone County and were responsible for maintaining order across several hundred square miles of difficult mountain terrain with limited transportation and communication resources. Their initial examination revealed that the building appeared to have been vacated hastily, with personal belongings scattered throughout the rooms and no indication that the occupants had made systematic preparations for departure. Food remained in the pantry, some of it beginning to spoil, and clothing was found draped over chairs and scattered on the floor of the bedroom. The condition of the interior suggested that the family had left suddenly, possibly during the night or early morning hours when normal packing and preparation activities would have been difficult. Most items of significant value remained in the house, including Eleanor's jewelry, Thomas's tools, and household furnishings that could have been sold for substantial sums if the family had been planning a voluntary relocation. The presence of these valuable items argued against theories that the family had departed voluntarily to seek better opportunities elsewhere or to escape financial difficulties that might have made continued farming unviable. Of particular note was the condition of the attic space, which the deputies accessed using the wooden staircase that Thomas had built when the house was constructed. The attic was supposed to be unfinished space that was used only for storage of seasonal items and equipment that were not needed for daily household activities. However, the deputies discovered that the area appeared to have been recently occupied for living purposes, despite the fact that it lacked proper flooring, insulation, and other amenities that would be necessary for human habitation. The deputies found makeshift sleeping arrangements consisting of quilts and pillows arranged on the rough wooden flooring, along with what appeared to be several days' worth of food scraps and empty water jugs. The sleeping area had been positioned near one of the small windows at the end of the attic, presumably to take advantage of natural light and ventilation. Personal hygiene items, including a wash basin and towels, suggested that someone had been living in the space for an extended period, despite the obvious discomfort and inconvenience. Most puzzling was the discovery of numerous small holes that had been bored through the attic floorboards at various locations throughout the space. The holes, each approximately the diameter of a finger, had been drilled in a seemingly random pattern that provided direct sight lines down into the rooms below. Wood shavings around the holes indicated that the drilling had been done recently, likely within the past few weeks, and the tools used for the work were found nearby along with other evidence of deliberate modification to the structure. The deputies could find no practical explanation for these modifications to the house. The holes served no apparent structural or ventilation purpose and seemed designed specifically to allow observation of activities in the rooms below. The systematic nature of the drilling suggested careful planning and considerable time investment, implying that whoever had made these modifications had been present in the attic for an extended period and had specific reasons for wanting to monitor activities in the occupied portions of the house. Sheriff Hayes's investigation also revealed that someone had been living in the attic for an extended period prior to the family's disappearance. In addition to the sleeping arrangements and food remnants, the deputies found a small collection of personal items that did not appear to belong to either Thomas or Eleanor Treadaway. These included a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten notes in an unfamiliar script, a pocket watch bearing an inscription to someone named William Garrett, and several articles of men's clothing that were too small to have belonged to Thomas. The discovery of these foreign items in the attic immediately suggested that an unauthorized person had been living in concealment in the Treadaway house, possibly for weeks or months before the family's disappearance. This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation, transforming it from a simple missing persons case into a potential criminal matter involving unlawful entry, concealment, and possibly kidnapping or worse crimes against the missing family members. The journal proved to be particularly significant as it contained detailed observations about the daily routines and conversations of the Treadaway family, apparently recorded by someone who had been watching and listening to them from the concealment of the attic space. The entries, which began in late July 1880, demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the couple's private discussions, personal habits, and emotional states that could only have been acquired through systematic and prolonged surveillance of their most private moments. Early entries in the journal focused primarily on mundane domestic activities, with notes about mealtimes, household chores, and conversations about farm work and community affairs. The unknown author recorded details about the family's daily schedule, including the times when Thomas departed for work in the fields and when Eleanor performed various household tasks. These observations were written in a detached clinical style that suggested the author viewed the Treadaway family as subjects for study rather than as human beings deserving of privacy and respect. However, as the weeks progressed, the tone of the observations became increasingly intrusive and disturbing. The unknown author recorded private conversations between Thomas and Eleanor, including discussions about their personal finances, concerns about Eleanor's health, and intimate moments that no outside observer should have witnessed. The journal entries revealed knowledge of personal information that the couple had shared only with each other, suggesting that their concealed observer had been listening to their most private communications for an extended period. The author also demonstrated detailed knowledge of the family's social relationships and community connections, recording information about their interactions with neighbors, their participation in church activities, and their business dealings in Lebanon. This information appeared to have been gathered both through direct observation and through systematic eavesdropping on conversations that took place in various parts of the house throughout the day and evening hours. Of particular concern were journal entries from late August and early September that described what the author called experiments in influence. These passages indicated that the person hiding in the attic had begun deliberately making sounds designed to create anxiety and confusion among the home's legitimate occupants. The author wrote detailed accounts of tapping on the walls and floorboards during the night hours, calling out names in whispered voices, and moving small objects in the rooms below while the family slept. The journal entries describing these activities were written with a tone of scientific detachment, as though the author viewed the psychological distress of the Treadaway family as an interesting phenomenon worthy of careful study and documentation. The systematic nature of the harassment, combined with the clinical manner in which it was recorded, suggested that the concealed intruder possessed a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques and was deliberately implementing a campaign designed to undermine the family's mental stability and sense of security in their own home. The journal's author recorded detailed observations about the effects of these psychological manipulations on both Thomas and Eleanor, noting changes in their behavior, sleep patterns, and emotional responses to the mysterious disturbances. The entries reveal a calculated effort to escalate the harassment gradually, allowing the family's anxiety and confusion to build over time, rather than creating immediate panic that might have prompted them to seek outside assistance or investigate the source of the problems more aggressively. The journal's final entries, dated in late October, revealed an escalation in these psychological manipulations that coincided with the period when community members began noticing the family's increasingly erratic behavior and social isolation. The author described periods when he would remain completely silent for days at a time, followed by sustained episodes of noise and disturbance designed to maximize the family's distress and prevent them from adapting to any predictable pattern of harassment. These later entries also revealed the author's growing confidence in his ability to control and manipulate his victims, along with increasingly grandiose theories about his psychological insights and experimental methods. The tone of the writing became more self-congratulatory and less clinical, suggesting that the author's initial detachment was being replaced by a sense of power and satisfaction derived from his ability to terrorize the innocent family that had unknowingly provided him with shelter and concealment. The final entry, dated November 1st, contained a chilling statement of intent that provided important evidence about the intruder's ultimate goals. They understand now that their home is no longer their own. Tomorrow they will discover what I require of them. This entry was followed by detailed instructions for a final confrontation in which the author planned to reveal himself to his victims and present them with demands that would complete his transformation from concealed observer to active predator. Investigation into the identity of the journal's author led Sheriff Hayes to examine records of recent transient activity in Boone County and neighboring areas. Through inquiries at local establishments and interviews with residents who might have encountered strangers during the summer months, the sheriff learned that a man matching the general description suggested by the clothing and personal items found in the attic had been seen in the area during the period when the harassment of the Treadaway family began. Several witnesses recalled a stranger who had appeared in Lebanon during late spring or early summer, asking detailed questions about local families and property locations while claiming to be a surveyor working on behalf of the Norfolk and Western Railroad Company. This individual had presented himself as a professional land assessor who was gathering information about property values and ownership patterns in preparation for possible railroad expansion projects in the region. The stranger's questions had focused particularly on isolated farmsteads and families who lived at considerable distances from their neighbors, information that would have been valuable to someone planning criminal activities that required avoiding detection and interference from outside parties. Several residents recalled that the supposed surveyor had shown particular interest in the financial circumstances of various farming families, asking pointed questions about property ownership, mortgage obligations, and economic vulnerabilities that seemed to exceed the legitimate needs of railroad planning. Local merchant Samuel Crawford recalled that this individual, who had given his name as William Garrett, had visited his store on several occasions during the summer months and had asked pointed questions about the Treadaway family specifically. Garrett had inquired about their financial situation, social connections, daily routines, and other personal information while claiming to be assessing the property for possible railroad acquisition. Crawford had found these questions somewhat intrusive, but had answered them believing that he was assisting with legitimate business activities that might bring economic benefits to the region. The investigation revealed that William Garrett was not employed by the Norfolk and Western Railroad Company or any other legitimate surveying organization operating in Virginia during that period. Railroad company representatives contacted by Sheriff Hayes confirmed that no surveys or property assessments had been authorized in the Cripple Creek area during 1880, and no employee named William Garrett appeared in their personnel records. This information confirmed that Garrett had been operating under false pretenses and had used his supposed professional credentials to gather information for criminal purposes. Further inquiry into Garrett's activities during his time in Boone County suggested that he was likely a confidence man or professional swindler who had developed an elaborate scheme to acquire valuable farmland through psychological intimidation rather than conventional fraud or violence. The systematic nature of his information gathering and the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques documented in his journal indicated that property theft through intimidation was likely his primary criminal specialty rather than a crime of opportunity. The specific mechanism of Garrett's plan became clear through analysis of legal documents that were discovered hidden in the attic space, along with the journal and personal effects. These papers, which appeared to have been prepared by someone with considerable knowledge of property law and foreclosure procedures, outlined a complex scheme whereby the Treadaway family would be driven to abandon their home and subsequently forfeit their claim to the property due to extended absence and failure to maintain their mortgage obligations with the Lebanon Bank. Garrett's plan required detailed knowledge of the family's financial situation and psychological vulnerabilities, which he had apparently acquired through months of surveillance from his hiding place in the attic. The documents indicated that Garrett intended to present himself as a legitimate purchaser once the property entered foreclosure proceedings, allowing him to acquire valuable farmland at a fraction of its actual worth while avoiding the suspicion that would have accompanied more conventional criminal approaches to property theft. The legal documents also revealed that Garrett had prepared multiple false identities and supporting documentation that would allow him to complete property transactions without revealing his true background or criminal history. These materials included forged letters of credit, fabricated references from fictional business associates, and other fraudulent credentials designed to convince bank officials and legal authorities that he was a legitimate and financially capable property purchaser. Sheriff Hayes's investigation expanded to include inquiries in neighboring counties, where similar cases of abandoned farmsteads and mysterious disturbances had been reported over the previous 2 years. These investigations revealed a pattern of activity that suggested Garrett or Confederates had been operating throughout southwestern Virginia, targeting isolated farming families with similar methods of psychological intimidation and property theft that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of rural social dynamics and legal vulnerabilities. The investigations in neighboring counties uncovered at least 4 additional cases where farming families had abandoned their properties under mysterious circumstances that paralleled the Treadaway situation. In each case, the affected families had reported unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched or followed, and gradually escalating sense of unease that ultimately drove them to flee their homes despite significant financial investments in land and improvements. Local law enforcement agencies in these neighboring counties had generally treated the abandoned properties as cases of voluntary departure by families seeking better opportunities elsewhere, a common occurrence during the economic uncertainties of the late 19th century. However, when the cases were examined collectively in light of the evidence discovered at the Treadaway house, a clear pattern emerged that suggested coordinated criminal activity rather than coincidental personal decisions by unrelated families. The broader investigation also revealed that psychological intimidation schemes targeting isolated rural families were not unique to Virginia during this period. Similar cases were documented in West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and southwestern Pennsylvania, suggesting that criminal organizations had recognized the vulnerability of farming communities to this type of exploitation and had developed systematic approaches to property theft that avoided the risks associated with conventional crimes such as robbery or burglary. The success of such schemes depended on the isolation of the victims and their reluctance to seek help from authorities who might not understand or believe their accounts of the harassment they were experiencing. Rural families during this period were accustomed to resolving problems through individual effort or community cooperation rather than involving outside law enforcement, creating opportunities for sophisticated criminals to exploit their self-reliance and social isolation. The fate of Thomas and Eleanor Treadaway remained unknown despite extensive searches of the surrounding area and inquiries throughout the region. Sheriff Hayes organized search parties that combed the forests and creek valleys surrounding the abandoned property, looking for any evidence of violence or indication of the direction the family might have taken when they fled their home. These searches continued for several weeks but yielded no significant clues about what had happened to the missing couple. No evidence was found to suggest that the Treadaways had come to physical harm, but neither did they ever resurface to reclaim their property or contact relatives and friends who might have provided assistance. The couple simply vanished as completely as though they had never existed, leaving behind only the disturbing evidence of the ordeal that had driven them from their home and the mysterious figure who had orchestrated their psychological torment from the shadows of their own attic. The investigation into William Garrett's identity and background continued for months after the discovery of the abandoned Treadaway house, but law enforcement agencies were unable to locate or apprehend the man responsible for the family's disappearance. The trail of evidence suggested that Garrett had fled the area immediately after the family's departure, possibly moving on to other regions where he could continue his criminal enterprise without interference from authorities who had become aware of his methods. Some investigators theorized that Garrett was operating as part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in property fraud and had developed the psychological intimidation techniques as an alternative to more conventional and risky criminal approaches. However, no definitive proof of such a conspiracy was ever established, and Garrett himself remained as much a mystery as the fate of his victims. The Treadaway house remained abandoned for several years following the investigation, as no buyers could be found for a property associated with such disturbing circumstances. Local residents reported continuing strange sounds from the building during this period, though these reports were generally attributed to structural settling, weather effects, and the natural tendency of abandoned buildings to create unusual acoustic phenomena as they deteriorated. The property eventually attracted the attention of treasure seekers and curiosity seekers who believed that valuable items might have been left behind by the fleeing family or hidden by William Garrett during his occupation of the attic. However, repeated searches of the building and surrounding grounds yielded nothing of value, and the property continued to deteriorate as weather and neglect took their inevitable toll on the structure that had once housed a thriving farming family. The house was finally demolished in 1887 after the roof collapsed during a winter storm, making the structure unsafe for even casual exploration. The land was eventually sold to neighboring farmer Samuel Hensley, who incorporated it into his existing holdings and gradually returned the abandoned fields to productive agricultural use. However, local residents noted that Hensley never built any structures on the site where the Treadaway house had stood, preferring to use the area only for pasture and crop production. Martha Hensley, the neighbor who had loaned Eleanor Treadaway a shotgun during the early stages of the crisis, preserved detailed records of the entire incident in letters to relatives and entries in her personal diary that provided valuable insights into the community impact of the mysterious events. These documents, discovered among her effects after her death in 1903, offered perspectives on the case that had not been available to contemporary investigators and helped later researchers understand the broader social context of the tragedy. Martha's writings revealed the extent to which the Treadaway disappearance had affected the entire Cripple Creek community, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that persisted for years after the events. Neighbors became more cautious about welcoming strangers, more attentive to unusual sounds or activities on neighboring properties, and more likely to seek assistance from law enforcement when confronted with unexplained phenomena that might previously have been dismissed as unimportant. The case attracted periodic attention from researchers and journalists interested in documenting unusual criminal cases from the late 19th century. A comprehensive investigation was conducted in 1924 by state authorities working in cooperation with local law enforcement to examine similar property fraud schemes throughout the Appalachian region and develop improved prevention strategies for protecting isolated rural families from such exploitation. The 1924 investigation identified similar cases throughout Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania, where isolated farming families had been targeted by confidence men using psychological intimidation tactics to acquire valuable property at reduced cost. The investigators concluded that the Treadaway case represented one of the more sophisticated examples of this type of criminal enterprise, demonstrating the elaborate planning and extended commitment that such schemes required to succeed. Analysis of the evidence collected from the Treadaway house revealed additional details about Garrett's methods that had not been apparent during the original investigation. Examination of the holes drilled through the attic floorboards showed that they had been strategically positioned to provide optimal observation points for monitoring activities in every room of the house, demonstrating sophisticated planning and an understanding of the family's daily routines that could only have been acquired through careful, preliminary surveillance. The makeshift living quarters found in the attic also revealed the extent of Garrett's commitment to his criminal enterprise and his willingness to endure considerable discomfort and inconvenience in pursuit of his goals. Evidence suggested that he had lived in the cramped, unfinished space for at least 3 months, surviving on provisions that he had somehow acquired and stored without detection while avoiding any contact with the legitimate occupants of the house. The discovery of multiple water storage containers and preserved food supplies indicated that Garrett had prepared carefully for an extended period of concealment and had developed systems for meeting his basic needs without leaving the attic or alerting the family to his presence. The sophistication of these arrangements suggested that similar operations had been conducted previously and that Garrett had refined his techniques through experience gained in other criminal enterprises. Records from the Methodist Church in Lebanon provided additional insight into the psychological impact of Garrett's activities on the Treadaway family during the months leading up to their disappearance. Reverend Morrison's correspondence with denominational authorities included detailed descriptions of Eleanor Treadaway's deteriorating mental and physical condition during the final weeks before the family vanished, documenting symptoms that were consistent with severe anxiety, sleep deprivation, and psychological trauma. The church records also revealed Thomas Treadaway's unsuccessful attempts to seek help from religious authorities and community leaders during the crisis. Morrison noted that Thomas had visited him on at least 3 occasions during October, each time appearing increasingly desperate and confused by the circumstances affecting his household. However, Thomas's reluctance to provide specific details about the source of his family's distress prevented Morrison from offering effective assistance or connecting the family with appropriate resources. Financial records from the Lebanon bank where the Treadaways maintained their mortgage revealed that Thomas had made inquiries about selling his property during the final weeks before the family's disappearance. Bank President Charles Fleming noted that Thomas had seemed unusually anxious to complete a quick sale, even if it meant accepting less than the property's full market value, suggesting that Garrett's intimidation campaign had successfully created the psychological pressure necessary to drive the family from their home. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Garrett had made preliminary contact with potential purchasers for the Treadaway property even before the family's disappearance. Local attorney James Patterson discovered documents indicating that Garrett had approached several land speculators about acquiring farmland in the Cripple Creek area, describing himself as an agent representing families interested in relocating to other regions where better economic opportunities might be available. These preliminary negotiations would have positioned Garrett to move quickly once the Treadaway property became available through foreclosure proceedings, allowing him to complete the acquisition with minimal legal scrutiny or delay. The advanced planning demonstrated by these activities confirmed that Garrett's scheme had been carefully designed and implemented over an extended period, rather than developed as an opportunistic response to circumstances he had encountered by chance. State investigators in 1924 identified at least 6 other cases in southwestern Virginia where similar psychological intimidation tactics had been used against farming families between 1878 and 1885. In each case, the targeted families had abandoned their properties under mysterious circumstances, and the land had subsequently been acquired by buyers whose identities and backgrounds could not be thoroughly verified through conventional investigation methods. The pattern of activity suggested a coordinated criminal enterprise that may have involved multiple Confederates operating across a wide geographic area, sharing information about potential targets and refined techniques for psychological manipulation that had been developed through experience and experimentation. The success rate of these operations indicated a sophisticated understanding of rural social dynamics and legal vulnerabilities that would have required considerable study and preparation to acquire. The broader investigation also revealed that psychological intimidation schemes targeting isolated rural families were not unique to the Appalachian region during this period. Similar cases were documented throughout the rural areas of the United States, where geographic isolation and limited access to law enforcement created opportunities for sophisticated criminals to exploit vulnerable populations through nonviolent but highly effective intimidation techniques. Modern analysis of the Treadaway case has focused on the psychological techniques employed by William Garrett to create the desired effect of terror and helplessness in his victims. Criminal psychologists have noted that Garrett's methods demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and the ways in which sustained uncertainty and fear could be used to manipulate decision-making processes and undermine rational responses to threatening situations. The gradual escalation of disturbances, combined with periods of complete silence that prevented the family from adapting to any predictable pattern, created a state of chronic anxiety and hypervigilance that would have been psychologically exhausting and increasingly difficult to maintain over extended periods. This technique exploited fundamental human needs for predictability and control, systematically undermining the family's sense of security and competence in managing their own environment. The use of concealed observation to gather intimate knowledge of the family's private conversations and personal routines was particularly effective in creating a sense of violation and vulnerability that extended far beyond the immediate physical threat. By demonstrating awareness of information that should have been known only to family members, Garrett was able to create the impression of an omnipresent and inescapable threat that made normal life impossible to maintain. Garrett's decision to remain hidden rather than confront his victims directly also served important strategic purposes in maximizing the psychological impact of his activities. By keeping his identity and exact location unknown, he maintained the element of mystery and unpredictability that enhanced the terror experienced by his victims while preventing them from taking direct action to address or eliminate the threat they faced. The systematic nature of Garrett's surveillance and the detailed records he maintained in his journal demonstrated the calculated and methodical approach he brought to his criminal enterprise. Rather than relying on random intimidation or impulsive violence, Garrett developed a comprehensive understanding of his victims' psychological vulnerabilities and designed his harassment campaign to exploit specific fears and anxieties that would be most effective in achieving his ultimate goal of property acquisition. Historical researchers have noted that the Treadaway case represents one of the earliest documented examples of what would now be recognized as psychological warfare techniques being employed for criminal purposes rather than military or political objectives. The methods used by Garrett anticipated many of the intimidation tactics that would later be employed by organized crime groups and other criminal enterprises, seeking to acquire property or eliminate business competition through nonviolent means that avoided the legal risks associated with conventional crimes. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of rural communities to sophisticated criminal enterprises. During the late 19th century, when isolation that provided farming families with independence and self-sufficiency also made them attractive targets for criminals who could exploit their distance from law enforcement and limited access to outside assistance. The success of Garrett's scheme depended partly on the reluctance of rural residents to seek help from authorities and their preference for attempting to resolve problems through individual effort or community cooperation. Contemporary accounts of the Treadaway case in local newspapers reflected the broader social anxieties of the period regarding the security of rural life and the increasing mobility of criminal elements in American society. Editorial writers in regional publications used the case as an example of the need for improved communication between isolated communities and law enforcement agencies, arguing that better coordination might have prevented the family's victimization and enabled the capture of William Garrett before he could escape to victimize other families elsewhere. The long-term impact of the Treadaway case extended far beyond its immediate effects on the family and local community. The documentation of Garrett's methods provided law enforcement agencies throughout the region with valuable insights into the techniques employed by confidence men and property fraud specialists, leading to improved investigative procedures and prevention strategies that helped protect other vulnerable families from similar exploitation. The case was frequently cited in training materials for rural law enforcement officers and served as a model for understanding how psychological intimidation could be used as a criminal tool that was both highly effective and difficult to detect or prosecute using conventional law enforcement approaches. The detailed record of Garrett's activities provided by his own journal created an unprecedented opportunity for authorities to study the methods and motivations of a sophisticated criminal who had successfully operated for years without detection. Legal scholars have also studied the Treadaway case as an example of the limitations of 19th century property law in addressing sophisticated fraud schemes that exploited gaps in the legal system. Garrett's plan took advantage of foreclosure procedures that allowed property to be acquired without adequate investigation of the circumstances that led to abandonment, creating opportunities for criminals to profit from their own illegal activities without legal consequences. The case contributed to subsequent reforms in property law that provided greater protection for landowners and more stringent requirements for foreclosure proceedings, particularly in cases where property abandonment occurred under suspicious circumstances that might suggest criminal activity. These legal changes helped close some of the loopholes that criminals like Garrett had exploited to acquire valuable property through intimidation rather than legitimate purchase or inheritance. The Treadaway family's ultimate fate remains unknown to this day, despite periodic efforts by researchers and genealogists to locate descendants or trace their movements after leaving Boone County. Some historians have speculated that the family may have relocated to a distant region under assumed names, seeking to escape entirely from the traumatic experience that drove them from their home and start new lives where their past would not follow them. Others have suggested that the psychological damage inflicted by Garrett's sustained campaign of intimidation may have prevented the couple from successfully reestablishing themselves in any community, leaving them unable to form the social connections and economic relationships necessary for successful integration into rural life elsewhere. The complete absence of any subsequent contact between the Treadaways and their former neighbors, relatives, or business associates suggests that their disappearance involved more than simple relocation to escape an unpleasant situation. The thorough severance of all social and economic ties that had connected the family to their previous life implies that they felt compelled to abandon not just their property, but their entire previous existence in order to find safety and peace. This level of psychological trauma suggests that Garrett's methods were devastatingly effective in destroying not only the family's immediate sense of security, but also their ability to trust in the basic assumptions about safety and privacy that make normal social life possible. Local folklore in the Cripple Creek area has preserved memories of the Treadaway case through oral traditions that have been passed down through several generations of residents. These stories, while often embellished with supernatural elements that were not part of the original events, reflect the lasting impact of the case on the collective memory of the community and demonstrate the enduring power of the psychological terror that William Garrett unleashed in 1880. The Treadaway name continues to be associated with mysterious and unexplained occurrences in regional folklore, serving as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of isolated families to sophisticated predators who understand how to exploit the basic human needs for security and privacy. The case has become part of the cultural heritage of southwestern Virginia, representing both a specific historical tragedy and a broader warning about the dangers that can emerge from the shadows of ordinary life. Archaeological investigation of the former Treadaway property site has occasionally yielded artifacts related to the case, including fragments of personal items and structural elements from the original house that provide additional insights into the daily life of the family during the period of Garrett's occupation. These discoveries have confirmed many of the conclusions reached by earlier investigators and have provided new details about the physical conditions that existed at the property during the crisis. The case continues to attract interest from researchers studying the history of criminal psychology and the development of nonviolent intimidation techniques for acquiring property or controlling victims. Modern criminologists have noted that many of Garrett's methods anticipated tactics later employed by stalkers, domestic terrorists, and other criminals seeking to control victims through sustained psychological pressure rather than direct confrontation or violence. Contemporary law enforcement agencies have studied the Treadaway case as part of training programs designed to help officers recognize and respond to psychological intimidation crimes that may not involve obvious physical evidence or direct threats, but can be equally devastating to victims and communities. The detailed documentation of Garrett's methods provides valuable insights into the escalation patterns and psychological dynamics that characterize such crimes. The case has also been examined by social scientists interested in understanding how isolated communities respond to sophisticated criminal enterprises and the factors that contribute to successful victimization of vulnerable populations. The Treadaway case demonstrates how geographic isolation, limited access to outside assistance, and cultural preferences for individual rather than collective problem-solving can create conditions that sophisticated criminals can exploit to achieve their goals while avoiding detection and prosecution. The Treadaway case stands as a reminder that the most effective forms of terror are often those that exploit fundamental human vulnerabilities rather than relying on spectacular displays of violence or obvious criminal activity. William Garrett's success in driving a stable farming family from their home through nothing more than persistent psychological manipulation demonstrates the power of sustained uncertainty and fear to override rational decision-making and destroy the foundations of normal life. The echoes of that autumn in 1880 continue to resonate through the Virginia mountains, where residents still speak in hushed tones about the family who fled from voices that came from within their own walls. The Treadaway case serves as a testament to the enduring vulnerability of human beings to sophisticated predators who understand how to weaponize our most basic needs for safety, privacy, and predictability in our daily lives. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the Treadaway case may be its demonstration that home itself, the place where we seek safety and privacy, can become a prison when trust is destroyed and the shadows begin to whisper our names. The case reminds us that the greatest terrors are not always those that announce themselves with violence and spectacle, but those that creep silently through the foundations of our daily lives, undermining our sense of security and belonging until we no longer recognize the places we once called sanctuary. The story of the Treadaway family and their mysterious tormentor serves as a permanent reminder that evil often wears the mask of ordinary life, approaching its victims not with fanfare and obvious threat, but with patience, cunning, and an intimate understanding of the human heart's deepest fears. In 1880, a family discovered that the walls they had built to protect themselves could also conceal the very dangers they sought to exclude, and their flight into the unknown remains a testament to the enduring power of terror to transform sanctuary into exile.